A country being seen as historically subordinate to Russia doesn't give it a special place in Russian strategic thinking because there are so many countries around Russia's western periphery that it thinks are subordinate to it and should remain so. One of the devices that I use for trying to get this concept across to people who have not looked closely at the Russian mindset is a comparison of two maps, one historical, one present day. A map of the Russian Empire in 1914, which of course includes not just the Russia we know today, but also states around the periphery, Central Asia, the Caucasus, even Finland and Poland. And then a children's wall map, which I acquired in Moscow about a decade ago, called Karta Nashei Rodiny, a map of our motherland. And the key point here is that it is not the map of Russia that we know. Instead, it is that same map of the Russian Empire, similar to the extent of Moscow's power during the Cold War. And this, unfortunately, is the mental map to which Vladimir Putin is working. When he explained to the Russian population why he was launching the so-called special military operation against Ukraine in February 2022, he talked about correcting the historical mistakes made by the early Bolsheviks, which he said led eventually to the creation of these independent states around Russia and not subordinated to Russia. This, he said, was an error, and this needed to be corrected, and the first to be corrected was Ukraine. The implication, of course, is that this will not necessarily be the last, and of course that includes countries which are now full-fledged members of the EU and NATO, like the Baltic states, like Finland, like Poland. It's true that among Russia's former dominions, Ukraine has a special status for various reasons, including the way in which Ukrainian history has been hijacked by Russia to explain its own origins. Back in 2021, I was working with a British TV station that was producing a documentary on Russian history, which they wanted to call 1,000 Years of Russian History. The problem is when you actually look in detail at Russian history, you realize there is nothing like that. It only works if you tack on the other state of Kievan Rus that existed well before the Muscovite state emerged. So you have to somehow awkwardly bridge a gap between what was happening in what is now currently today Ukraine and something else that happened entirely separately several hundred kilometers to the northeast and a couple of centuries later. And all the history elides this gap and pretends it doesn't really exist. I pointed this out to the producers of this show and said their title didn't really work, but of course they had to run with it. So there was just an awkward gap with no explanation between talking about Kiev and the civilization that was there and then a separate entity that emerges later, which eventually turns into Russia. The problem, of course, this is so deeply embedded in the fictitious version of Russia's history that has been taught both inside the country and outside it, that it is now exceptionally difficult to challenge because it is accepted as fact.